afternoon, we have some very special guests joining Team USA for a very special presentation. Ms. Linda Kirker is a longtime friend of USA who has brought her knowledge of government and Constitution to our community, to our school for many years. She connected our community to today's guests, knowing that they'd be a good fit for our team. Today we will experience a teaching program by the Liberty Players called Brushfires of Freedom, featuring Lawrence Zupan and Zachary Zupan. This program and presentation is about constitutional principles and how our country was founded and why it's so special. Please welcome our guests to Team USA.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. It's great to be here with all of you. Thanks for giving me this opportunity to share with you some of the things that I love to talk about the most. Have you experienced that the times when it's easiest to talk about things is when you get to talk about really what you care about and what you love? For example, just coming up Route 7 on the way here, I get to be reminded of some of the magnificent history that occurred almost within shouting distance of St. Albans. It's a little bit further to the south, in the lake. How many here have heard of a man named Benedict Arnold? Everybody. Now everybody's heard about him because his name is usually equated to, starts with a T. What is it usually equated to with? Traitor, right. Before he was a traitor, he was probably the most brilliant American soldier. He was fearless, he was strategic, and he rode into battle. And it was he who took the fledgling American Navy to meet the British right out here on Lake Champlain, a little further south, and kept them from getting back to Fort Ticonderoga that year. So it's just great how many things have happened in Vermont and in our area. But this gives you a cue as to what is most passionate in my heart. And it is the history and the founding and what made America and what has continued to make America special. Today we're going to answer a few questions, either directly or indirectly. We're going to answer questions like, why was America founded? Why did it need to be founded? What was wrong with the way things were before we had the American Revolution? What do we have now that we didn't have then? What do we not have now that we had then and that we're happy for? Let me ask you a question. Think for a moment. What time do you get out of school? 3 o'clock? You go home today, and instead of the usually warm welcome you get at your house, you find that there's tanks and armored cars outside your house, and there's a soldier in front telling you, guess what? We've just moved into your house. All right, you can still stay here in the basement, the garage, or out back, but we have moved into your house. Somebody want to raise their hand and tell me how they feel about that? Yes?
I don't want.
Right. And you, how would you feel?
Well, since how my basement is dirt,
Yeah.
how would you like to see what it's like? And then shove them and lock them in the basement.
Right. I like that attitude. And that's the attitude that Americans responded to because the British had this thing called the Quartering Act, where they could just come and show up in colonial America and say, guess what? We're the British soldiers. We're staying at your house. Sorry if you don't like it. You know, your attitude is an attitude based on the fact that we're Americans. We grew up knowing that nobody's got the right to barge into our house and take over. Do you know why they don't have that right? And why we have the right to say, stop at the door? It's something called the United States Constitution. It's something called the Third Amendment to the Bill of Rights, but we'll get to that in a moment. These are the rights that we didn't have before. Or how about this one? How about the day after they show up to take over residence at your house, somebody shows up from the British tax department, or this now the American tax department, says to your parents, you're not having a trial, we've decided you owe all the money you have and the house, we're taking it over, and you have no right to complain in court or to make your case. What would that be like, to be out in the street without a house and without any money? That is routinely what would happen in colonial America, because the British monarchy ruled the colonies with something called taxation without, anybody know the third word? Yes.
Representation.
Right, which is a long way of saying, we take your money, you shut up. Okay, now, some people might feel that it's getting a little bit like that now, but we'll talk about that another time. The point is, we have redress. We have the right to approach and complain about something in our country if we feel the government is not treating us fairly. And this gets to one of the most exciting facts about America. So it also it raises the question as to what is the job of government? What is the proper role of government? Is it supposed to take from us, or is it supposed to protect us? Is what it takes from us supposed to be for our benefit and protection, or is it supposed to be just according to the whims of whomever happens to be running the government? These are important questions that get answered by the American Constitution. So there's one word that defines why we had to have the American Revolution. One word that defines the reason for the American Revolution. Anybody want to take a stab at what that word is? Yes, sir.
Freedom.
Oh boy. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And freedom, freedom, freedom. 3 times over. Freedom is why we had to have the American Revolution. Of course, that implies that we didn't have it before, but we have it now. Now, tell me, does it become automatically, if you chase people who are oppressing you out of your country, who are keeping you from being free, that you automatically have freedom right away? Is that automatic?
No.
No. Why? Because you have to have some structure to guide and protect the rights of every individual so that they can enjoy their freedom. And the Declaration of Independence started us on this path. The Declaration of Independence said that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, what does unalienable mean? Does anybody know what unalienable means? It's a long word, yes.
Means it can't be taken away from you.
Well said. It can't be made alien. It can't be, it's built in. It's almost like your DNA. The DNA of America is liberty and freedom. No doctor could take away your DNA from you. No force on earth should be or could be or ought to be permitted to take away the freedom of Americans. So the Declaration declared the separation from our oppressors. Then the next most important document was the U.S. Constitution, which codified and described what our freedoms are and how we were going to retain it. Now, I'm about to tell you in the next minute the one thing that if you forget everything that I said today, you'll at least remember this. I'm going to tell you that in a minute. And the reason I'm saying that is because it's the most important thing I have to share with you. Does anybody know what the Constitution of the United States gave to us Americans that was completely unique in the history of the world? Yes.
We did not have to be ruled by a king or queen.
That's part of it. But what we would be ruled by, here's the thing, that gets to the beginning, that's the threshold of the answer. The full answer is yes?
That not one person can overpower the other branches. So like the president can't overpower the judicial or legislative.
That's an excellent point. It's not the one I was going for, but it's an excellent point. Let me tell you what I'm getting at. The U.S. Constitution established that the people, we the people, the preamble to the Constitution starts off, we the people. Why? Because it's all about we the people. As the Declaration declared, the government derives its just powers from we the people, the governed. The government exists because we allow it to exist. We give it permission to rule over us, but within certain limitations that protect our rights. So for the first time in history, we have a structure where our individual rights are senior and more important than the rights of the government. Let that sink in, because you need to understand, we've all grown up, myself included, although many decades ago, with this freedom of America. We don't even know how bad things could have been or were or could be again if we don't protect our freedoms. It used to be that the government, whether it was the monarch, whether it was any kind of dictatorial tyrant or any other system, had absolute rights over the citizenry, and if the citizens didn't like it, they'd better shut up about it or they'd be in even bigger trouble. But now, we have rights that the government can't take away. In fact, they were so important that after the Constitution was written at first, they came back and established the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Anybody know what those are called? Yes?
Bill of Rights.
Right. Wow, the Bill of Rights. And these rights, this Bill of Rights codifies things that the government cannot transgress, cannot step across, cannot take away from us. And what is amongst the first rights that you would think are so important? Yes?
Free speech.
Right. The government cannot tell you to shut up. I mean, maybe your parents can, and they should sometimes, and they will, but the government,
Especially me, that's for sure.
the government cannot tell you when to talk, how to talk, and what the content of your speech is. Now, that doesn't mean that you can go into a movie theater and start yelling, or you come into a classroom and be disruptive. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the content of your speech cannot be dictated by the government. You think that that's just automatic because you always grew up with it. But there were times when that was not so. And there are many countries in the world right now where that is not so. And what else is part of the First Amendment? Freedom of what else?
Freedom of press.
Right. Press, which is an extension of freedom of speech, printing your ideas. The government can't tell you what you're allowed to print. You can print whatever you want to print. Now, there's certain legal limitations about libel or speaking in a certain way about other people. That's false. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about printing ideas, philosophies, your opinions. You're allowed to do that. I exercised that right yesterday when I sent out my opinion letter to every paper in the state. Now, maybe some will print it and some won't, but the point is that I have the right to send out that letter, and nobody can tell me to change the content. So, this, again, I want to emphasize what I want you to remember, that the American U.S. Constitution protects the rights of the citizens above the rights of the government. That the citizens have rights that the government can't take away, that, as this young man defined for us, inalienable, they can't be taken away. So let's talk a little more about the Bill of Rights, shall we? We talked about the first one, freedom of speech and freedom of the press. What's another important freedom that we have in there? Someone who didn't raise their hand yet. All right, well, you're the man.
The right to bear arms.
That's the Second Amendment. That's a goodie, too. The other part of the First Amendment is freedom of religion. You might say, well, of course I've got freedom of religion. I can have whatever religion I want, but it wasn't always that way. In the beginning, it was an official Church of England, which is why the Pilgrims left England, went to Holland, found that they didn't like the influence of the Dutch culture, and then got in a little boat about half the length of this room, all 360 of them, packed in, and for 70, 80 days went across an ocean that they had no idea what was on the other side. They risked their lives, and many of them died at sea, and many of them died in the first year. Why? Because freedom of religion, how they would worship their God, was so important. It's so vital. Isn't it wonderful as you grow older and decide what you believe about God or not to believe about God, you have the freedom to choose that. That is in the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment to the Constitution. And yes, the right to bear arms is the Second Amendment. The right to bear arms was considered to be so important that it was right after freedom of speech, religion, and press. That a person has the right to defend themselves. It seems like common sense that a person would not have the right to defend themselves and their family curtailed by the government. That's why it was codified in the Second Amendment. And then the third amendment is the one I talked about, where the soldiers could come into your house. No. The third amendment says, guess what? You can't. Don't even think about it. And they don't, because they know it doesn't work. The government cannot send soldiers into your home. The Fourth Amendment, protection from unreasonable search and seizure. Would you like to stand up? I want to show everybody something. So say I'm a policeman, and I just don't like the way you look, and I just come up to you and say, empty your pockets. Oh, wait a minute. Don't be in such a hurry. I'm not saying you shouldn't respect authority, but there has to be reason, there has to be just cause for someone to search you, your house, or your person. Keep your pockets full of whatever they are. I have no right to ask you, but thank you for being cooperative. There's such a thing as respecting authority, and there's a certain thing as standing up for your rights with dignity and respect. And we are protected from unreasonable searches and seizures. That same house that the tax collectors can't just seize, they also can't just come in and rifle through your papers and your software and decide what to keep and what to take. That would be an unreasonable search and seizure. We have procedures in this country. If there's a cause where they think you've committed a crime, they have to go to a judge and get something called a warrant to come into your house to search it. And that is a reasonable procedure for capturing criminals, but protecting the rights of everybody else. Likewise, your property. Remember, in the Declaration it said we are entitled to be protected, that we are endowed with certain rights from the Creator, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How well could you pursue your happiness if all the possessions you worked for and you thought were yours could just be taken away from you by other people, or even by the government? You couldn't pursue your happiness very well if you couldn't provide for your food, your clothing, your shelter, or so after doing so, somebody just took them away. So you have the Fifth Amendment that protects your property, and it protects it in a codified way that your property can only be taken from you under very specific legal constraints. Item 6. Did you ever notice that sometimes when people are accused in public of crimes, that it automatically seems, because the accusation is so neon lights and it's talked about in such detail, that the tendency is to think, oh, they're guilty already? But guess what? In this country, we have the presumption of innocence until you're proven guilty. An accusation is just an accusation. It has to be proven in a court of law before you are subject to a penalty. Common sense, yes, but it had to be codified into the U.S. Constitution. So there is a whole set of rights that people who are accused of wrongdoing have. And that is covered in Amendment 7 as well. And Amendment 8 is about excessive bails, fines, and punishments. You know, we're not a culture that cuts off your hand if you steal a loaf of bread. That would be a little bit of an excessive punishment, wouldn't it? So we have a system where punishments for breaking laws are proportional to the crime itself. Amendments 9 and 10. Some people think that these are among the most important clauses, amendments, or parts of the Constitution. You know, we have a tendency to think that what's most important is what we say. And frequently that's true. But were you ever in a situation where the most important thing you could do was to not say something? Anybody ever have that situation? Yeah, right. Sometimes not doing something is the correct action. And that pertains to the government, and that's what Amendments 9 and 10 are about. Amendments 9 and 10 say that whatever rights the whole Constitution doesn't give to the federal government are left to the states or to the people. In other words, the people's rights are widely extensive and don't have to be laid out and enumerated. Only the rights that go to the government have to be stated. So that every right, the government can't say, well, we're going to take this right from you because the Constitution says if it isn't spelled out in the Constitution, that right belongs to you. It stays with you and the government cannot take it away. The government can't tell you what color hair to have, what kind of clothes to wear. It sounds almost silly to even suggest. The point is there's thousands of things like that, those rights that reside with individual citizens that the government has no rights over. When those pilgrims that I talked about came across the ocean, they did something really smart. Right when they dropped anchor just off the coast of Massachusetts, they said, well, wait a minute now, we're about to go ashore and we're a loose congregation or assembly of people. We have to have some rules to govern ourselves. And we have to all agree to these rules so that we have something that's not anarchy. Anybody know what anarchy is?
Chaos.
Yes?
It's chaos, no rules.
Right.
Do whatever.
Yeah, and that doesn't work because wherever there's people, everybody has to have certain understanding of other people's rights. So they got together on the Mayflower and they all agreed to something called the Mayflower Compact. And why was this so important? Because it was the first time in the New World that a free group of people got together and gave the authority of government, according to their own will, collectively, to a governing body drawn from their own numbers. And this, my friends, was the foundation, the framework, the origin of what came later in our ingeniously developed government, which one of the young folks here said a moment ago was talking about the division of the government to divide the powers between the legislature, the judicial, and the executive. There's innumerable cases of ingenuity and brilliance in the Constitution and the way it's laid out that makes us such a free people that have so many rights and opportunities to blossom. I was thinking yesterday, I was just counting because it changes every few years when I think about it. It's 243 years, our country is 243 years. Okay? That may sound old to you, but in the scheme of world history, it's not an old country. Now, what I'm about to say to you, people might say, oh, you're jingoistic, you're nationalistic, you're hyper-patriotic. You know, I could be accused of a lot of things. But when I say that the United States of America is the greatest country in the history of the world, call me what you will, I can back it up. I can back it up because our country has grown and fed and housed and clothed with freedom and liberty and been a model to more countries in the world than any other country in the history of the world. And there's a reason why our country has grown to the size and the gross national product and the brilliance that it has. And it all comes back to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are the bedrock foundations that have given us our greatness. So as you go forward in life and as you grow, I really urge you, I beg you to remember when people try to talk about the Constitution as if it's some living Constitution is the cute phrase that it's talked about. When you call something a living Constitution, you're saying, well, it's living, I can change it, I can let it grow and change with me as I want. No, if the Constitution is to be changed, there's a way to change it built into it. You cannot change the Constitution illegally or by whim. I would like you to be as jealous about the United States Constitution as you would be the ladies if you were just given a new diamond engagement ring, that you would protect that. That guys, forgive me for stereotyping, that guys, if Tom Brady handed you one of his 6 Super Bowl rings, how you would guard that, okay? I'm saying, you know, there's some guys who, ladies here who might like the Super Bowl ring more than the guys. I allow for that, that's true. I'm coming from the old school where things used to be that way more or less, so indulge me. So imagine how you feel about those things. Would you leave those rings laying around the table in the men's room and forget about them? No, you guard them, you protect them, you covet them, you look at them, you enjoy them. I want you to feel the same way, if it's imaginable, about the United States Constitution. Because the United States Constitution is going to give each of you the chance to not only have the best rings that you could ever imagine, but have the best life that you could imagine. Because here in the United States of America, you have a platform to be who and what you want to be. By focusing and determining what you want your life to be, there's nobody who can tell you no. You have unlimited potential here because the government does not sit on top of your shoulders pushing you down. The government is meant to get out of your way according to the Constitution and let you live your best life imaginable. So there's some amazing things that happened at the founding of our country. You know, as Vermont students, you probably all know the story of Ethan Allen, right? Anybody here not heard of Ethan Allen? So we know about an hour south of here is where he lived last in Burlington, 45 minutes from here. We also know that Ethan Allen was the man who, along with Benedict Arnold, yes, that same Benedict Arnold, stormed Fort Ticonderoga and established the first major battle, a success of the Americans. And that battle led for us to take over Fort Ticonderoga, which is only about 100 miles southwest of here across the lake. The bravery, when the British started to take back a couple of years later, the British positioned themselves with cannons on Crown Point and were targeted down on the fort. They had to escape across Lake Champlain into Vermont. And this is the only battle that really took place on Vermont soil. The Battle of Bennington, as you probably know, took place a little bit over into New York. In Hubbardton, so in Hubbardton is where the Americans made a stand. And it was a wonderful rear guard action that enabled the escaping Americans who were retreating from Fort Ticonderoga to make it down to Manchester, where they were joined by John Stark from New Hampshire and Seth Warner, who went down to Bennington and won that battle, which ultimately caused the British to be weakened so that the Battle of Saratoga could be won, the first really full-scale, full-field battle between the colonial Americans and the British. And the winning of that battle, all of which was made possible by the things that happened in Vermont, is what was the turning point of the Revolutionary War and which brought the French in on our side. Now, there's a lot of talk these days about socialism. And many people have different opinions about socialism. I invite you to study the opinions of those who think socialism is a good thing. And I invite you to study the opinions of those who think the American model of free enterprise is far superior. It's not going to surprise you to know which side of that debate I come down on. When I sat across the table from Bernie Sanders, when I debated him in 2018 as his Republican opponent for the US Senate, I said to him, I said, how come you're not championing Venezuela anymore? Because you used to champion Venezuela with such vigor until, of course, the middle-class citizens started dumpster diving for dinner and the socialist model collapsed. To which he tried to respond that, why do you mention Venezuela? Why not talk about some of these Scandinavian successful socialist countries? At which point I felt obliged to remind him that the Scandinavian countries are not socialist at all. They're countries that believe in private property, free enterprise, and from the revenues they generate, they are able to have a larger welfare state, but even that they're turning away from. My friends, socialism, in my opinion, is the opposite of freedom. Socialism puts on the veneer of caring about other people. Their motto is they're going to take from everybody who has and give to everybody who needs. But that's not the way it happens, and it's not the way it works. What it really is a government grab of material and production and a redistribution according to the whims of those in power. whereas free enterprise creates new, wonderful products, goods, and services that expand the potential for all Americans and everybody all over the world. Free enterprise is what really provides the most charitable possibility for those who cannot take care of themselves. I invite you to study this debate because I believe that this debate is at the heart of why the country is being challenged right now by those who would change our entire system from free enterprise to socialism.
Mr. Zupan?
Yeah.
I hear what you're saying, but wouldn't it also be fair to say that free enterprise also significantly took advantage of people and their rights in our country, and that there is some need for looking over free enterprise to ensure that people who are less educated and don't understand as well are being taken advantage of?
Well, if you're talking about something called crony capitalism, wherein the government provides favoritism to certain corporations at the disadvantage of the rest of American citizens, I'd say absolutely yes. Are there rules and laws that need to be put in place to protect citizens as our country has grown more complex? Absolutely. Is any system perfect without flaws where people are not taken advantage of and even oppressed by the very system that could liberate them? Absolutely. So yes, there are definite ways that a free enterprise system needs to be governed properly. Rules need to be put in place that pertain to everybody, not just the chosen oligarchical few that are favored by the politicians who may have received benefits from them. So that type of crony capitalism is what I'm opposed to, as much as I'm opposed to socialism. What I love is the entrepreneurial creativity, where somebody starts with an idea, starts with something that has never been done before, or perhaps just like that. You know, Steve Jobs in his garage in 1975. You know, Bill Gates and Paul Allen in their garage a little later. The idea that they could overcome a company like IBM just with their ingenuity and their insight could almost only happen in America. So now they themselves, Apple and Microsoft, have become behemoths. So is there appropriate ways that government must deal with major corporations? Yes. But one must look at the number of jobs and the amount of business activity, the amount of creativity that comes forward from the soil of free enterprise. It greatly outweighs the negatives that might come along with it. You know, as long as people are imperfect, and everybody is, and they always will be, at least for as far as we can see, there are going to be people who game a system, who cheat a system, or who exploit other people. So free enterprise is not free from those possibilities. But I suggest that it is the best system available to anybody in this world. If there's anybody who has a better system than constitutional, creative, free enterprise, I'd love to know about it because I'd love to adopt it in my own life. But what I have adopted, and I'm speaking as someone who grew up in a socialist home. I grew up hearing about the joys of socialism and how it was such a fair system. But as I got older and started to work for a living, I began to realize that compassion from the government is like it's like getting kissed by your sister. You know, to put it blunt, you know, it doesn't have the real ring of love, passion, and romance. Now, some of you might like to kiss your sister, but I hope you get the idea. Compassion from the government is not real compassion. Here's who can be the most compassionate. A person who has worked for a living, has built a business, has earned enough money so that he can hire people who can support their families, who all earn a good living, who produce goods and services that people love and use, and who has enough money left over to donate to causes that he thinks helps other people. That's compassion in America at its best, as I see it. I wanted to share a story with you before I close, or give you the opportunity to talk, ask me some questions. There was a time after all of the battle was over, and the revolution went from 1775, the battle of fighting, to 1781. But then there was a time of 2 years where the peace treaty was being negotiated, and all of the officers with George Washington were in Newburgh, New York, waiting for the final treaty. And after this final treaty was to be given, then the officers who'd not been paid their back pay, whose families were suffering sacrificial deprivation for years, at a certain point, the soldiers in Newburgh were starting to mutiny. The word of this proposed mutiny came to General George Washington. George Washington realized that everything they'd fought for was at stake, because if the officers overthrew the revolution and put in place some other form of government, other than what the Constitution was going to be when it was produced, that all of that sacrifice could go right down the drain. So perhaps, as wonderful as George Washington was, he was a great soldier, a great general, and ultimately a great president. One of the most significant things George Washington ever did, I'm going to reenact it for you here, if you just give me your attention. So George Washington comes before, imagine you're all of these officers that are getting ready to mutiny, and you're even angry at George Washington, but yet you know that George Washington stood right up on the horse in front of every battle that he was at, and he put himself on the line as much as any of them. So they all had this tremendous respect for him, even though they were mad because they hadn't gotten paid for years. So General Washington comes there and he says, General Washington comes out in front of them and says, "My dear officers, I hope you'll indulge me because I have almost grown blind in the service of my country while I put on my spectacles." And by the time George Washington read what he started to read, the mutiny was broken, because they saw that George Washington had sacrificed more than all of them. The mutiny, the back of the mutiny was broken right there. And right there, George Washington saved the American Revolution. All my young friends here, I want to say to you that while you go about your lives and everything is normal and routine, that the United States of America is calling upon each of you to save the American Revolution also. Perhaps not in the same fashion as George Washington, but to save the American Revolution by growing up with the love and understanding of what our forefathers gave us when they gave us the U.S. Constitution and liberation by revolution, and that it can be taken away from us if we don't fight to preserve it. And the fight is in the realm of ideas and in votes, in public participation, in supporting candidates that you know will be as jealous of your liberty as you are of that Super Bowl ring or the engagement ring. That is the fight that each of you is going to be called upon to carry. You'll either ignore it, or you'll rise up to the opportunity and the occasion, and you'll show real greatness in your fervor to preserve the Republic of the United States of America. So thank you very much for your kind attention. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to address them. I hope I answered your question.
Oh, you did good.
Thank you. Anybody have any questions? Oh, yes, sir.
I wonder if you could speak to them. We hear the words democracy and republic kicked around a lot.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could kind of explain to them the difference between a democracy and a republic, and how the founding fathers were actually scared of a democracy almost as much as they were a monarchy.
That is extremely well said. And what your teacher just said about the founding fathers being scared of a democracy was so true. You might think that that's surprising, because haven't we all grown up, heard about America's this great democracy, great democracy, great democracy? Well, actually, America has democratic principles built into what it really is, which is a republic. Here's the problem with the democracy. A democracy could be described potentially as two wolves and a sheep debating what they're going to have for dinner. You got it? In other words, the majority can take away the life and property of the minority. That's not right. Every minority is protected in a republic. In a republic, we have a structure of laws that protect the rights of every person and every individual. And that's what makes us a republic. We have an association based on the rule of law that protects the rights of every individual, even if they're a minority of 1 against 320 million. They have rights. In a democracy, the majority can just decide to take away whatever they want. Now, to the extent that democracy is a good word that should be utilized appropriately, democratic principles include the right of the people. Demo is a Latin word for root word for people. The right of people to participate in the republic. So, it could be said that we have a democratic republic nature of a country, but the important nature of our country is as a republic, not as a democracy. I hope I haven't confused you with that explanation. Any other questions? Anybody have a favorite Revolutionary War character? From the Revolutionary...
My great-grandpa.
Really? Yeah. Tell us about him.
Pretty much all of my ancestors went in the army. And that's all I really know. I know that my family fought in World War II.
Wonderful. God bless them. You know, it's wonderful to be, I pity the people who grew up in the west part of the country where they can't turn around and run into history and descendants of the American Revolution all the time. Even in New York City, where I grew up, there's so much American Revolutionary history, and so many descendants I meet of people who were pivotal in the founding of the country. And here too, you know, you drive past Hubbardton, you drive by the Bennington Monument, you go to the Bennington Battlefield, you go to Saratoga, and you realize how much heart and love and sacrifice was put forward so that we could have this country. And it was done by people who were just like your parents and uncles and aunts just 243 years ago. Any other questions? I'd like to thank you again for your kind attention.